and welcome to my channel. My name is Madeline and I am a fashion designer, and I'm going to be taking you through everything that you need to know to start a clothing collection, from the very basics all the way out to completing a collection. A little bit of background on me. So I currently work as a clothing designer. That is my full-time job. I also do freelance projects in technical design and sewing, pattern making, that sort of thing. And I also have a bachelor's degree in apparel entrepreneurship, so I had a cool degree that was split between fashion and business. And because of that, I feel like I'm in a really good position to share information that maybe is hidden for a lot of people or is inaccessible for a lot of people. I know that it took me a long time to find the program that I really felt like I could thrive in. I went through 3 different colleges, 4 or 5 different majors before I settled on one that really felt like what I could finish my degree in, and it turned out to be a perfect fit. I found my dream job, and so I just want to be able to share with others the kind of information that you should know if you are hoping to be a fashion designer, whether that's starting your own collection or working as a designer. What do you really need to know? So we're going to be starting with the very basics, and that is the elements and principles of design as they apply to fashion and clothing. So let's get into it. A quick note as we get going with this is that I'm going to be doing my best to talk about all of these elements and principles in an objective sense. So I'm just going to describe them to you. I'm not going to be saying this is how you do it to make good fashion, or this is bad fashion, or this is ugly clothing. Fashion is an art form, and what you think looks good or not is largely determined by your upbringing and culture, as well as your personal sense of style and design. And so I don't want to be pushing that away or saying that it's bad. It's up to you as a designer to decide how you use these elements and principles, and whether you use all of the elements or principles. That's up to you as the designer. The first element of fashion design is line, and that is really a moving point. So the easiest way to think about it is this is more one-dimensional. So the typical way that you think of lines would probably be fashion illustrations, so your hand-drawn sketches or maybe your computer-generated sketches if they're one-dimensional. And so that is really how you use straight lines, curvy lines, crisscrossing lines, squiggly lines. How do you use lines to get your design point across? And another way you could think of this is in fabric design. So your fabric could have horizontal lines, vertical lines, plaid lines, anything like that. Design for fabric usually uses line in some way if it's a print for the fabric design. So you can see in this design that I designed and sewed for my graduation dress that the fabric has a checkered print or gingham, and so it's using crisscrossing lines to have a specific effect. So as I was mentioning, with your design style being affected by your culture and where you live, and also your personal design style, I usually associate, and I think a lot of people do, especially in the West, the gingham print with kind of like a summery, picnicky feel. And so that's one of the main reasons why I picked this fabric, is because the gingham felt very summery and I wanted it to feel like a very summery dress. So there you have line. The next element of fashion design is shape. So shapes are flat enclosed areas that have 2 dimensions, which are length and width. So you also see this a lot in fashion illustration. So obviously when you're creating the actual garment shapes, so if you want a puffy sleeve, how are you going to create that shape, right? So you're going to have some puffs and then probably a straight hem, something like that. How do you create those shapes, and what do those shapes mean, and why do you have those shapes? So another way you might use this is with a neckline like this neckline that I have here. It's a square neck, so it's creating that specific shape, a square. It's out of negative space, but it's creating the square neckline for a specific effect, right? So it gives a specific look, and that's the look that I wanted for this design. Another way you might think about this is in especially fashion vocabulary, like why is it called a mermaid tail skirt, right? That's a specific shape that we're following for the skirt. So this is definitely an important one to keep in mind as you're designing, and I can do a whole other video on fashion vocabulary because there are a ton of different shapes to keep in mind, like different sleeve shapes, collar shapes, neckline shapes, waist shapes, skirt shapes, any kind of different thing. Shape is an extremely important aspect of fashion design because that is really the silhouette. Color is an extremely important element of fashion design, and of course you have any color available to you that you can find fabric for, right? So you have your whole red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, any whites, blacks, grays, browns, anything that you can find. And this is one that's really important to think about culturally. What do the colors represent, and how do you want to get that message across? And so going back to this yellow dress, I live in a place in the West that experiences all 4 seasons, and yellow is typically pretty associated with sunshine, summertime, or springtime flowers and nature, and also a place that really loves the summertime and waits for the summertime and is excited for the snow to melt. And so it kind of represents hope and excitement. And so I included that. That's one of the reasons why I picked this yellow for this dress, was so that it would feel like happy and exciting, and it felt like, you know, I was graduating college, so it felt like a symbol of hope. So for me, that's what that yellow helped represent. If I lived in another place that yellow didn't really feel that way, and I didn't grow up with that mindset, I might not view it the same way. But that's why it's important to understand the cultural significance of colors and your personal significance of the colors and how you want to get that across in the design. Another element of fashion design is form. And so this is kind of going back to kind of the line and shape, but form is the 3-dimensional version of that. So really it's objects that are 3-dimensional, so they have length, width, and height, so they take up volume and space. So every piece of clothing is going to be a form because it has to be 3-dimensional to go onto somebody's body, right? So if it's helpful to think about, line is 1-dimensional, shape is 2-dimensional, and then form is 3-dimensional. So going back to the example of this yellow dress, let's look at the skirt. So the lines would be, you know, this straight line hem, that is a line, but the shape that goes all the way around it, if you were to draw around it, it kind of looks like a bell, right? But a 2-dimensional bell. But the form of it really looks like a bell because it's a circle. If we're looking at it like top down, the hem creates a circle and it goes up into a gathered skirt. So, and then if you were to twist it like this, it looks like a bell, right? So that would be kind of the form. So hopefully that helps to kind of simplify that for you and help you understand how they're different from each other. Texture is a really big part of fabric choice when it comes to clothing design, and so that's, you know, the feel of the actual surface, and, you know, does it feel soft, is it furry, is it silky, how does it feel, what's the texture? You can sometimes see texture and sometimes you can't, you can just feel it, but that is something to really consider when you're designing, is how does the texture play into the overall look and feel of the garment. Space is another element of fashion design, and there's kind of 2 different ways that you could think about it. In your flat sketches, you might use space to create the illusion of depth, so to make it look like it's 3-dimensional, even though it's just 2-dimensional. But you can also use space in designs, like, for example, using negative space, like a cutout. If you have a little cutout, why are it creates this negative space so you see somebody's skin. Or if you're doing a big garment that has, maybe some negative space in a bow or something like that, how do you use the space? Because it's a three-dimensional garment, it already has the depth, but how are you using space to either create more depth or create less depth? That's up to you as the designer. For example, in this yellow dress, the neckline is a square, but the square is really created with negative space, but that has a specific effect. Alright, had to take a little break, but now we're back. And now we're going to talk about the principles of fashion design. And essentially the elements are what you put into your designs, the lines, shapes, textures, and the principles are how you arrange the elements in a design. The first principle of fashion design is balance, which refers to the balance or the distribution of the visual weight in a garment and the distribution of the different elements. If something feels balanced, you get to decide as a designer if you want it to be balanced or not. But if something is balanced, it usually feels a little bit more easy to look at. And there are typically three different kinds of balance that we talk about. So there's symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, and radial symmetry. So symmetrical balance is the simplest, and that just means that balance is achieved through symmetry. So it looks the same if you were to draw a line down the center of the garment. It's the same on this side versus this side. Repeated lines, colors, shapes, it's equal, and that is how it achieves balance. Asymmetrical balance means that if you were to draw a line down the middle, it's not symmetrical on both sides, but that does not mean that it's not balanced. It means that it achieves balance through other ways, not through symmetry or repeating the elements. So even though you could draw a line down this and it doesn't look the same on both sides, they have used different elements to create that visual weight, different shapes and textures, and that is how it feels balanced. You see this a lot in evening gowns. And then radial symmetry is where there's kind of a central point and then the balance or the visual weight kind of radiates out like a sunburst. And you see that a lot in draped pieces like this dress, or you can also see it in this kind of style where you have the center and then it kind of, is radiating out. The next principle of fashion design is unity, and that is how all the elements work together in a garment or in a collection to create a feeling of harmony or unity. And again, you get to decide as a designer whether you want something to feel unified or not. And if you do want it to feel unified, how do the elements work together to create that feeling of the whole being, more important or having more weight than the singular elements? So a way that I use this a lot as a fashion designer is, especially in a collection, is making sure that the whole collection feels unified. So by having a specific theme, maybe a specific color palette or a pattern grouping, something that kind of pulls the whole thing together so that it feels unified and creates a harmonious feeling. And you can see kind of in this collection there are specific, the accessories are the same, there's a specific color theme. That's how it's kind of pulling it together, even though these garments are all different from each other. There are common elements that create a harmonious feeling. Variety is another principle of fashion design, and it's how you use the different elements to kind of disrupt repetition or create juxtaposition, and how you basically are doing the opposite of repetition. And I think it's important to note that you could still have a unified collection while still having a wide variety of elements and designs within a collection. So for example, this collection, it still looks very unified, but there's lots of variety, lots of different shapes and colors, lots of different shapes and lines and forms within the collection, so it feels like there's a lot of variety, but it still feels unified. Emphasis is used in fashion design to create a focal point. So how do you use the different elements of art or elements of clothing design to create a focal point? It's an element that really stands out the most in a design. So for example, this one, you can see this left chest area stands out the most because it's a different color, it's a different texture, a different pattern, and so your eye kind of goes directly there, and that is using emphasis. Movement is a principle of fashion design that refers to how you're using the elements of design to move the viewer's eye through the design. So you could use this in a collection or in a specific design, but how do you use the different elements, whatever element you choose from the list that I talked about earlier, to lead your eye through the piece? So this is a really great example. This is obviously using line to move your eye really directly through the piece, because your eye goes from this line to this line to this line to this line, and that is how it creates this movement, this feeling of, it's like, okay, your eye is really following throughout the piece. A pattern in fashion design is just a repeated object or symbol or design element within a piece or within a collection, and it kind of ties and can create unity or harmony. But it's really simple to think about it in terms of a printed design like this, how you see this same pattern repeated over and over, but you can also repeat other elements like these ruffles. In this case, it's using a specific pattern to create a specific effect. Proportion in fashion design talks about how different elements relate to each other in size and shape. So it's really talking about at least two elements, how they compare to each other. And so for example, in this dress, the tight-fitting bodice with the voluminous skirt, that's how they compare to each other. The proportion of them together creates a specific effect. And something that I was taught in school, which of course this is subjective, but something I was taught was that you could do all the colors right, do all the sewing right, do everything like that correct in a garment, or, you know, in an aesthetically pleasing way, but if the proportion is off, then it just won't feel right still. And so if you feel like you've done all those other things the way that you wanted to, but it still just doesn't feel quite right, maybe look at the proportions. And at least in our Western society, there is some considered more aesthetically pleasing proportions. So that would be 1 to 2, 2 to 3. There's a whole Fibonacci sequence. Of course, that is societal and cultural, but that's just something to be aware of, that typically people in Western society view 1 to 2 as a more aesthetically pleasing proportion than 1 to 1. But of course, up to you as a designer to decide how you use that, and if you want things to be proportioned in that way or in a different way. But for example, you could look at this dress as the bodice is the one, and then 2 of those bodices could fit in that skirt lengthwise, so it's 1 to 2. So that's a good way to think about it. I hope this was helpful for you in understanding how the elements and principles of design work specifically with clothing, and I hope you're one step closer to creating your clothing collection. Don't forget to subscribe so you can follow along and learn everything else that you need to know. You can find me on Instagram and Patreon. Please leave any questions below, and if you'd like me to deep dive more into any of these elements, because obviously there is a lot more to them than just this basic rundown, then let me know if you'd like any more in-depth videos. Thank you, see you next time!